Racist cop grabs black woman unaware she directs the silent investigation, closing in on his informant network. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to the main character as the afternoon light settled over the courthouse steps and the rhythm of the city moved with its usual confidence. Naomi Carter stood where most people passed without a second glance, her posture calm, her eyes steady, her presence unremarkable by design, while a few yards away Officer Daniel Cross carried himself with the certainty of a man accustomed to rooms parting for him. Voices lowering, questions disappearing, his badge catching the sun as if it were a shield rather than a symbol. And when he noticed Naomi lingering near the perimeter, he did what he had done 100 times before, stepped into her space with practiced authority. His voice clipped, his tone final, his hand closing around her wrist long enough to signal control, without spectacle, convinced that compliance was a rule written into the air around him, unaware that the woman before him had already mapped the paths of his confidence and measured the distance between noise. In consequence, Naomi did not pull away, did not raise her voice, did not perform fear for the moment that had been scripted for her, because the work she led thrived on stillness and patience, on the quiet accumulation of facts that never needed applause. And as people nearby slowed and watched, unsure of what they were seeing, Cross spoke as though the scene belonged to him, referencing procedures and assumptions that sounded official enough to pass without challenge, while Naomi listened with the attentiveness of someone who understood systems better than slogans, her breathing even, her gaze never locked in defiance, but focused somewhere beyond him, as if tracking a larger pattern moving into place. Cross believed he recognized every face that mattered in his city, every name worth remembering, every ally who owed him something, and in his world informants whispered. At the right times, cases closed with convenient speed, and oversight arrived late, if at all, but what he could not see was the quiet lattice forming behind the day's ordinary noise, the interviews logged without fanfare, the records cross-checked by people he had never bothered to notice, the timelines aligning not to embarrass a man, but to expose a mechanism, and Naomi stood at the center of that effort without announcing it. Because the strongest leverage is often invisible until the moment it moves. The crowd's curiosity ebbed and flowed as Cross released his grip and stepped back, satisfied that he had made his point, and Naomi adjusted her sleeve with a small, unremarkable motion, the kind that leaves no impression. Yet within her phone rested a chain of confirmations that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what was coming. While across town a file updated itself, a call returned itself, and a calendar quietly advanced toward a deadline that could not be argued with. Cross turned away, convinced the encounter was finished, another routine assertion in a day full of them. But Naomi remained exactly where she was, not because she had been delayed, but because she was on schedule. And as the city continued its confident stride, the investigation she directed continued to close in with the calm inevitability of gravity, proving once again that power does not need to announce itself to be absolute. The city moved on quickly after moments like that, absorbing them into the larger rhythm of sirens in the distance and footsteps on stone, and Officer Daniel Cross walked away from the courthouse steps with the familiar assurance that nothing he did there would follow him home. Because for years his days had ended the same way, with reports signed, calls returned by the right people, and quiet messages passed through channels that never appeared on any official record, a system that rewarded him for knowing who talked and who stayed silent. While Naomi Carter entered the building with the unhurried pace of someone who was never late, her reflection briefly crossing the glass doors as she passed inside, blending into clerks, attorneys, and visitors who carried folders and coffee cups without curiosity. Inside, the air carried the low hum of routine, fluorescent lights steady, voices softened by policy and habit, and Naomi moved through it as She always did. Not as a target, not as a challenger, but as an observer cataloging details that others dismissed as background noise. The cadence of conversations, the timing of movements, the way certain names caused doors to close just a little faster. While Cross returned to his patrol, Rout convinced that control was maintained by presence alone, by being seen and recognized, by reminding people who decided how a story began and ended. What he did not notice was how often his own name had begun appearing in places he never reviewed, in reports that did not circulate through his usual channels, in schedules that aligned too cleanly to be coincidence. And Naomi was aware of all of it without acknowledging any single piece as important, because her work required patience measured in weeks and months rather than minutes. A discipline learned from watching investigations fail, when urgency replaced clarity. As the afternoon unfolded, calls were placed and received across the city, none of them dramatic, none of them urgent. Yet together they formed a pattern that Cross would have recognized instantly had he been looking, but he was focused on the immediate, on the comfort of familiarity, on informants who still answered when he called and believed their protection remained intact. Naomi took a seat near the back of a public office, reviewing paperwork that appeared ordinary to anyone passing by, her pen moving slowly, her expression unchanged, while elsewhere a database updated itself with timestamps that could not be altered, and an analyst she trusted confirmed a detail she had already expected, not with excitement, but with a single line of confirmation that required no response. Cross ended his shift as he always did, checking in with a colleague, exchanging remarks that signaled alignment, his confidence reinforced by repetition, unaware that repetition was exactly what had made his habits predictable. While Naomi stepped back into the late afternoon light with the same composure she had maintained all day, the city reflecting off nearby windows, as if nothing beneath the surface had shifted. Yet the shift was already in motion, quiet and irreversible, driven not by confrontation but by documentation, not by outrage but by structure. And as Naomi walked toward the next obligation on her calendar, she did so knowing that the most effective investigations were the ones no one felt until they were complete, and that the certainty Cross relied on was not strength at all, but inertia waiting for a reason to stop. Naomi Carter had learned long ago that the safest place to hide authority was in plain sight, and the following morning proved no different as she arrived at a modest office building a few miles from the courthouse, one that blended into a row of similar structures with neutral paint and unremarkable signage, the kind of place people passed every day without curiosity. And inside, she took her usual seat at a shared table, greeting no one by name, exchanging only polite acknowledgments that revealed nothing about hierarchy or purpose, because the work she oversaw depended on the absence of ceremony. Her background was not recorded in headlines or framed on office walls, and those who worked alongside her understood only what they needed to know, which was that her instructions were precise, her timing deliberate, and her expectations consistent, qualities that allowed complex efforts to move forward without friction. Across the city, Officer Daniel Cross followed his routine with equal confidence, stopping for coffee at the same corner shop, exchanging familiar remarks that reinforced his sense of belonging, unaware that familiarity had become his most limiting habit, because the patterns he relied on were now being mirrored and measured by people who did not need his cooperation to understand him. Naomi reviewed notes that morning that referenced names Cross trusted, individuals he believed existed in the gray spaces of enforcement where loyalty could be purchased with protection. Yet to her they were simply data points, their conversations already documented, their timelines already aligned, their influence shrinking as quietly as it had grown. She did not celebrate progress or mark milestones aloud, because her approach favored continuity over recognition. And when a colleague asked a procedural question, she answered without emphasis, guiding the next step as though it were inevitable rather than strategic. Meanwhile, Cross received reassurances that reinforced his assumptions. A return call, a nod from a supervisor, the comfort of a system that responded to him as it always had, and he mistook that response for security rather than delay. Naomi understood the difference well, having watched enough cases fail when decision-makers confused immediate calm with lasting control. And as the day unfolded, she observed how easily confidence insulated Cross from curiosity, how his certainty prevented him from noticing. The subtle changes around him, the pauses and responses, the slight shifts in tone, the names that were no longer mentioned as freely as before. By mid-afternoon, Naomi stepped outside briefly, the sun reflecting off parked cars, the sounds of traffic steady and indifferent, and she took a moment to observe the city not as a landscape of confrontation, but as a network of routines intersecting without awareness, the perfect environment for a quiet reckoning. She returned inside to finalize a sequence that required no announcement, only confirmation. And as she did, Cross attended a meeting where his presence alone seemed to settle concerns, reinforcing his belief that he remained essential, not realizing that systems evolve most effectively when they no longer depend on any single figure. Naomi concluded her workday without urgency, securing materials that appeared ordinary and leaving nothing behind that suggested momentum, because the success of what she directed depended on its invisibility until the final moment. And as she walked back into the evening air, she carried no sign of satisfaction, only the calm focus of someone who knew that authority, when exercised correctly, never needed to raise its voice, and that the distance between control and consequence was closing, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. The following days brought a subtle tightening of the atmosphere around Officer Daniel Cross, though nothing he could point to or challenge directly. Only small inconveniences that felt beneath notice yet refused to disappear, a delayed response to a request he expected to be immediate, a meeting rescheduled without explanation, a familiar name no longer answering the phone with the same ease. And he dismissed each instance as coincidence because his confidence relied on the belief that coincidence always favored him. Naomi Carter observed these shifts from a distance that was neither physical nor emotional, reviewing progress through neutral updates and measure confirmations, never attaching urgency to what was unfolding because the pace had been chosen carefully to allow habits to reveal themselves without resistance. Cross continued to move through his days with visible authority, speaking with certainty, correcting others with practiced assurance, and relying on a reputation built over years of being perceived as effective, unaware that effectiveness without scrutiny often concealed fragility rather than strength. Naomi understood that moment well, the point at which confidence began to separate from awareness, and she allowed the process to continue, uninterrupted, knowing that interference too early only strengthened denial. As Cross worked through another week, he began to sense that conversations ended sooner than before, that information arrived already filtered, that familiarity no longer translated into influence. Yet he attributed the changes to administrative shifts rather than intention, because intention implied oversight, and oversight was something he believed existed only in theory. Naomi attended briefings where her presence went unremarked, contributing only when necessary, her guidance framed as procedural rather than directive, allowing others to believe they were simply following established protocols, while in reality each step aligned with a structure designed to test the integrity of what Cross depended on most. He noticed that an informant hesitated before answering a routine question. Another postponed a meeting without explanation, and for the first time irritation surfaced beneath his composure, not outwardly, but in the calculations he made as he tried to reassert control through familiarity rather than adaptation. Naomi did not respond to these movements with acceleration or confrontation, because pressure often clarified loyalties faster than force, and she allowed the system to apply that pressure evenly, removing the need for her presence to be felt directly. One afternoon, Cross reviewed a report that seemed complete yet lacked the detail he expected, a minor omission that unsettled him more than it should have because it suggested someone else had reviewed the material before him and decided what mattered, and that realization lingered longer than he was comfortable admitting. Naomi received confirmation that evening that the omission had been noted elsewhere, not corrected, simply preserved as evidence of pattern, and she acknowledged it with the same calm she applied to every update, because patterns, once established, required no interpretation. Cross returned home unsettled without understanding why, his sense of authority intact on the surface, yet increasingly dependent on reassurance rather than certainty. While Naomi closed her day knowing that the distance between assumption and accountability had narrowed again without announcement. She did not measure progress by visible reactions or emotional responses, but by alignment, by the way independent elements began to move in unison without prompting, and as the city settled into its familiar evening rhythm. She trusted the process she directed to continue forward, confident that systems built on silence eventually speak for themselves when they reach their limit. By the end of the week, the investigation had entered its most delicate phase, the point Naomi Carter had anticipated from the beginning, where information no longer needed to be gathered but simply allowed to surface on its own, and she adjusted her approach accordingly, reducing her visible involvement even further so that every development appeared organic rather than directed. Officer Daniel Cross, meanwhile, began compensating for discomfort he could not explain by leaning harder on routine, reviewing files more often than necessary, calling contacts simply to hear their voices, reaffirming connections that once felt unbreakable. Yet each interaction carried a slight hesitation that had not been there before, a pause just long enough to suggest calculation rather than trust. Naomi noticed these hesitations through reports that described tone rather than content, timing rather than statements, because tone was often the first thing to change when certainty eroded, and she marked the pattern without comment, confident it would continue. One afternoon, she attended a meeting that seemed unrelated to Cross entirely, a discussion focused on procedural alignment and data integrity, yet several references overlapped with timelines Cross assumed belonged solely to him, and she observed how easily those references were accepted without question, indicating that his narrative no longer held exclusive authority. Cross received word that a routine audit had been expanded slightly, nothing alarming on the surface, simply a matter of consistency, but the expansion unsettled him because it introduced a variable he had not anticipated, and variables were uncomfortable for someone accustomed to predictable outcomes. Naomi approved that expansion earlier in the week without emphasis, framing it as maintenance rather than scrutiny, because scrutiny invited resistance while maintenance encouraged compliance. As days passed, small confirmations accumulated quietly, a document verified here, a timestamp matched there, each one insignificant alone, yet undeniable together. And Naomi ensured that no single person saw the entire picture, allowing the structure to assemble itself without dependence on her presence. Cross began revisiting old decisions in his mind, searching for the moment something had shifted, but he looked for disruption rather than alignment, not realizing that alignment was exactly what had changed. Naomi met briefly with a colleague who spoke in hypotheticals, referencing scenarios that mirrored Cross's methods without naming him, and Naomi responded with neutral affirmations that guided the conversation toward documentation rather than speculation, because documentation endured where speculation failed. Cross sensed distance growing between himself and the assurances he once took for granted, and though no one confronted him, the absence of reinforcement weighed heavier than opposition ever had, leaving him restless and alert to details he had previously ignored. Naomi finalized a sequence that required no immediate action, only readiness, and she confirmed it with a single acknowledgement that conveyed neither urgency nor concern, trusting that timing would provide both when needed. As the city moved through another ordinary evening, Cross reviewed a message twice before responding, uncertain whether silence or reassurance served him better, while Naomi closed her files knowing that the most revealing phase of any investigation was not the confrontation, but the moment just before it, when assumptions were still intact and choices were made freely. In that space, patterns spoke clearly, and she allowed them to speak without interruption, confident that what had been planted carefully was now ready to be seen. The transition into the next phase did not arrive with an announcement, but with a subtle shift in perspective, as Naomi Carter allowed herself a brief moment to review the path that had led here, not out of sentiment, but precision, because understanding sequence ensured nothing was overlooked, and she traced it back to the earliest indicators when unrelated reports began echoing the same inconsistencies, when timelines overlapped too cleanly to be coincidence, and when Officer Daniel Cross's effectiveness appeared strongest precisely where transparency was weakest. She remembered how easily his reputation had insulated him, how confidence functioned as camouflage, and how systems often mistook speed for success, allowing results to replace questions, and it was within that space that the investigation had taken root quietly. Naomi had not targeted Cross in isolation, because isolation distorted truth. Instead, she had observed the environment that rewarded him, the informal channels that normalized shortcuts, and the assumptions that allowed influence to circulate without verification. And she directed her attention there first, knowing that individuals revealed themselves most clearly through the structures they relied on. Cross, unaware of this reframing, continued operating under the belief that any review would focus on outcomes rather than methods, because outcomes were measurable and methods were negotiable. Yet Naomi's work reversed that emphasis entirely, documenting not what concluded a case, but how it traveled there, who intervened, who benefited, and who was consistently absent from accountability. She coordinated quietly with analysts who never needed to meet Cross or hear his voice, ensuring that every data point stood independently, capable of surviving scrutiny without context or explanation, because durability mattered more than persuasion. As she reviewed the compiled material, Naomi noted how often Cross's name appeared adjacent to unresolved questions rather than answers, how frequently decisions aligned with his interests without documented rationale, and how patterns emerged not from accusation but repetition. Meanwhile, Cross sensed that something was wrong without understanding its shape, experiencing a vague pressure that accompanied him through ordinary tasks, a sense that his decisions were being observed rather than accepted, and he responded by asserting familiarity, revisiting relationships, and emphasizing history, unaware that history was precisely what was being examined. Naomi moved forward without haste, recognizing that the most revealing moment was not the exposure itself, but the period just before it, when behavior remained unchanged because awareness had not yet arrived, and she allowed that period to extend long enough to confirm intent beyond doubt. She authorized cross-checks that required no explanation and received confirmations that required no interpretation, each reinforcing the same conclusion through independent means, and she ensured that the final sequence would not depend on her authority, but on convergence, so that no single voice could alter its course. Cross reviewed a summary late one evening and paused longer than necessary, sensing that something within it was incomplete, not missing information, but missing allegiance, and the realization unsettled him because it suggested neutrality where he expected alignment. Naomi closed her review knowing that the framework was complete, that the investigation no longer needed guidance, only time, and she stepped away without ceremony, trusting the structure to hold. As the city settled into another routine night, Cross remained unaware of how thoroughly his narrative had been reframed, while Naomi understood that the work was no longer about discovery but confirmation, and that confirmation, once secured, required no confrontation to be decisive. The reveal did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic entrances, but with a sequence of confirmations that unfolded across ordinary channels. And Naomi Carter observed it the same way she had observed everything else, quietly and without reaction, as notifications arrived that required no response, because they signaled completion rather than progress. Officer Daniel Cross experienced the shift differently, sensing it first as absence, the absence of expected replies, the absence of informal reassurances, the absence of the subtle protections he had never questioned until they were no longer there. And he attempted to fill that absence with action, reaching out to contacts who now spoke cautiously or not at all, their hesitation unmistakable even when words remained polite. Naomi did not need to watch Cross directly to understand what was happening, because the investigation had moved beyond observation into execution, a phase designed to operate independently of any single individual, including her, and she allowed it to proceed without interference, trusting the structure she had built to function exactly as intended. Throughout the city, routine processes aligned with uncommon precision, reviews completed in sequence, records matched against independent sources, and long-standing assumptions quietly replaced by verified conclusions, and none of it required explanation because the evidence spoke clearly within the frameworks that governed it. Cross was notified of a request that felt procedural on the surface, yet carried a tone he did not recognize, formal where familiarity once lived, and he responded carefully, aware that caution had replaced confidence, though he could not yet name why. Naomi received confirmation that the final components had converged, not through a single decisive message, but through multiple neutral acknowledgments that arrived from different directions, each reinforcing the same outcome without commentary. The network Cross had relied on began to contract without announcement, connections dissolving not through confrontation, but through documentation, and he noticed that information now reached him only after passing through layers he did not control, a realization that unsettled him more than accusation ever could. Naomi reviewed the final alignment briefly, ensuring that each conclusion stood independently, that no assumption relied on inference, and that every decision could be traced through clear, verifiable steps, because durability mattered more than impact. As Cross attempted to assert authority through familiar gestures, he found that authority now required explanation, a requirement he had not anticipated, and the effort to explain only highlighted the distance between his perception and the reality forming around him. Naomi remained absent from his awareness, precisely where she intended to be, because the reveal was not about her presence, but about the system correcting itself through its own rules. When the final confirmation arrived, it did so without ceremony, a standard notification delivered through official channels that required no interpretation, only acknowledgement, and Naomi noted it with the same calm she had maintained throughout, knowing that the moment of revelation was rarely dramatic to those who prepared for it. Cross received the same confirmation from a different vantage point, and for the first time he understood that the structure he trusted had not failed him suddenly, but had been evaluating him quietly for far longer than he imagined. Naomi closed her review and stepped away, her role complete, not because justice had been announced, but because it had been applied, methodically and without spectacle, and as the city continued its ordinary rhythm, the difference lay not in what people saw, but in what would no longer be possible, a change that required no explanation to endure. The consequences unfolded without spectacle, moving through established procedures with a steadiness that left no room for interpretation, and Naomi Carter observed the aftermath not as an ending, but as a transition, because systems rarely conclude so much as recalibrate, and she watched as reviews became permanent records, as provisional assessments solidified into determinations that no longer depended on opinion. Officer Daniel Cross felt the shift most acutely in the narrowing of his options, as conversations once informal became structured, as requests now required justification, and as familiar pathways closed not with resistance, but with silence, a silence that communicated finality more clearly than any reprimand could have. Naomi did not intervene or comment, because intervention would have suggested influence. And influence was no longer necessary once the framework had completed its work, and she allowed the outcomes to stand on their own merit, confident that they reflected process rather than preference. Cross attempted to regain footing through compliance, providing explanations where they were requested, yet each explanation seemed to introduce new questions, not because they were incorrect, but because they revealed assumptions that no longer aligned with the standards being applied. And the realization unsettled him as he recognized that the environment he once navigated effortlessly now responded to him with neutrality rather than deference. Naomi reviewed summaries that detailed how responsibilities were redistributed, how oversight increased incrementally without disruption, and how operations adjusted seamlessly to the absence of informal authority. And she noted the efficiency with which the system adapted, confirming her belief that resilience depended on clarity rather than loyalty. Cross became aware that his presence no longer shaped outcomes, that decisions proceeded without his input, and that the confidence he once projected now required substantiation, a reversal that forced him to confront the difference between control and permission. Naomi remained focused on closure, ensuring that documentation was complete, that transitions were supported, and that the process concluded without reliance on individual discretion, because discretion had been the variable most easily exploited. As days passed, Cross observed colleagues interacting with measured distance. Not hostility, but caution, a professionalism that left no space for appeal, and he recognized that the protections he relied on had not been removed abruptly, but had simply expired when exposed to consistent review. Naomi acknowledged the final confirmations with minimal attention, because her work emphasized sustainability over reaction, and she prepared to disengage entirely, knowing that continued presence could distort perception and invite speculation. The city absorbed the changes without pause, daily routines continuing uninterrupted, yet beneath that continuity lay a recalibrated understanding of accountability, one that did not announce itself but operated reliably through procedure. Cross faced the reality of diminished influence without confrontation, a quiet reckoning shaped by documentation rather than accusation, and the absence of spectacle left him without an audience for justification. Naomi concluded her involvement by ensuring that every conclusion could withstand scrutiny without reference to her role, satisfied that the investigation had achieved its purpose not by removing a figure, but by reinforcing a structure. As she stepped back fully, she understood that the most enduring form of justice was the kind that left no trace of the person who guided it, only a system that functioned more honestly than it had before, and that knowledge required no recognition to be complete. The final stage arrived quietly, as Naomi Carter returned to her routine without acknowledgement or recognition, her days resuming a familiar rhythm that concealed the scope of what had changed, because the measure of success in her work was never visibility but stability, and stability now defined the environment she moved through. Officer Daniel Cross, by contrast, navigated a landscape that felt unfamiliar despite its sameness. Offices unchanged, streets identical. Yet the assumptions that once guided him no longer held, and he felt the weight of that difference in every interaction that followed established rules rather than personal understanding. Naomi observed the system from a distance she maintained deliberately, noting how procedures once considered burdensome were now followed without resistance, how documentation replaced discretion, and how authority recalibrated itself around transparency rather than convenience. And she recognized that the absence of disruption was the clearest sign of lasting change. Cross confronted the reality of accountability not through confrontation, but through process, learning that explanations carried less weight than records, and that intent mattered less than consistency, a lesson that emerged gradually as each attempt to reassert influence met neutral response. Naomi closed the final file associated with the work not as an ending, but as confirmation, because the investigation had never been about a single figure or moment, but about reinforcing a standard that functioned regardless of who occupied a position, and she trusted that standard to persist without oversight. As weeks passed, the city continued its routines uninterrupted, people commuting, offices opening, systems operating with renewed clarity, and few noticed the difference because effective correction rarely announces itself, instead embedding quietly into daily function. Cross adjusted to his new reality without drama, recognizing that the authority he once exercised freely now required adherence rather than interpretation, and that the confidence he relied on had been conditional rather than inherent. Naomi reflected briefly on the early moments that had set everything in motion, not with satisfaction, but with understanding, because the most revealing truths often emerged not from conflict, but from contrast, from observing how power behaved when it believed it was unobserved. She resumed work elsewhere without reference to what had occurred, her role complete, her presence unnecessary, because the structure she helped align no longer depended on her involvement to maintain integrity. Cross moved forward aware that the environment now demanded consistency over influence, a shift that left little room for the habits that once defined him, and he recognized that the quiet nature of the outcome left no narrative to contest, only a record to accept. Naomi watched the system continue to function with measured reliability, confident that its strength lay in procedure rather than personality, and that its resilience would endure precisely because it required no central figure to enforce it. As time created distance from the events that reshaped the framework, Naomi understood that the true impact would not be remembered as a story, but as a standard, one that operated without acknowledgement, without recognition, and without pause. The city moved on unchanged on the surface, yet beneath that continuity existed a recalibrated understanding of accountability that required no explanation to persist. Naomi carried forward with quiet certainty, knowing that power did not need to announce itself to be effective, and that justice, when applied patiently and without spectacle, left behind not echoes, but foundations.